Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the Rural Press Club of Queensland's special November Lunch Series event. We're here to celebrate National Ag Day, and we are honoured to have with us today Australia's Federal Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry and Minister for Emergency Management, Senator Murray Watt, who we will be hearing from a little bit later. My name is Fran Becker. I'm a partner at Hamilton Locke and I'm the Deputy President of the club. I'm honoured to be filling in today for our President James Mason from Beef Central, who couldn't be with us here today, but he sends his regards and cheers on such an important day. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us. A special welcome to Mr Anthony Perrott, Queensland's Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, as well as a number of former Rural Press Club of Queensland presidents: Lisa Pellew, Stacey Wordsworth, Peter Lewis, Trent Thorne and Brendan Egan. Murray Watt is the 35th Federal Minister to have responsibility for the Australian agriculture sector and the 6th Federal Agriculture Minister to hail from our own state of Queensland. It is worth reflecting for a moment on the importance of Queensland to agriculture in Australia nationally. The gross value Queensland agriculture production is on track to exceed $23 billion this financial year. Queensland is also one of Australia's most diverse agricultural economies, accounting for 48% of the national cattle herd, 31% of Australian egg production, and 96% of sugarcane production. We produce 69% of Australia's mangoes, 65% of sorghum and capsicums, 63% of macadamias, 62% of sweet corn, 60% of avocados, and the list literally goes on and on and on. Meat processing is now Queensland's single largest manufacturing industry, employing an estimated 18,000 workers. But agriculture is more than just numbers on a page. I'm certain that for all of us here today, it evokes a deep emotional response for most of us. For me, it is early mornings, the baleful lowing of cattle, the smell of rain in the air, hard work and family. As the statistics show, agriculture is important not only to our state, but to our entire country. Farmers are the founders of civilization, and we're very pleased that Minister Watt has chosen to spend his first National Ag Day as Federal Agricultural Minister with us in his home state of Queensland, and we're looking forward to hearing from him more very soon. If you're tweeting today, please use the hashtag RPC National Ag Day. Now, today also has a different type of significance for our club, and it's my great pleasure to announce former Rural Press Club of Queensland President Brendan Egan and the current Chief Engagement Officer of Curida for a special announcement.
Thanks, Fran, and welcome everyone, and happy Agricultural Ag Day, 2022. Look, it's my great pleasure and honour today, on behalf of the Committee of the Rural Press Club of Queensland, to bestow life membership on a legendary rural storyteller and long-time contributor to the Rural Press Club. Peter Lewis is an award-winning rural journalist who spent a 40-year professional career sharing stories about the people, the industries and communities of rural and regional Australia across a range of media platforms, including newspapers, radio and television news and current affairs. Peter has travelled extensively on assignments throughout Australia and overseas, including a stint as the ABC's foreign correspondent in New Zealand, and also somehow he managed to attend 3 Olympic Games for the ABC. Not sure how he managed that. His passion, however, has always been for the bush and life beyond the end of the bitumen, which, as those of you know, is Peter's Twitter handle. And I guess it's there he came to national prominence as a reporter, and later as executive producer of the ABC's Landline program over a period of some 16 years, including over that period from 1997 to 2013. And later as ABC TV's National Rural and Regional Affairs reporter between 2013 and 2014. But it's, I guess, since retiring from the ABC, Peter has continued his passion for rural storytelling as a freelance rural journalist. And those of you know his company is Way With Words, which everyone knows Peter does. But he's been spending a lot of his time travelling, again, all over rural and regional Queensland, educating farmers and regional communities on how to tell their own important stories about the food and fibre they produce through the traditional, but also the new social media channels. Peter has encouraged and mentored many a young journalist over his career and is a former president of the journalist section of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. Significantly, Peter has been an active member of the Rural Press Club of Queensland, serving on the management committee for 5 years, between 2001 and 2005, including 2 of those years as president of the club. Indeed, it was Peter who coined the club's catch cry, "Where the bush does business," and he helped design the club's iconic windmill that those of you who have a Rural Press Club tie back in the day, together with a good friend and a former regional cartoonist, now a national cartoonist, Rod Emerson, who used to be based up in Rockhampton. Peter has been president of the Australian Council of Agricultural Journalists and helped push for the re-establishment of the National Rural Press Club in Canberra. He's also been an Australian delegate to the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists. Peter Lewis embodies all the criteria for life membership of the Rural Press Club of Queensland, with his significant service to rural journalism and his contribution to the club and its objectives of raising awareness of rural journalism at a state, national and international level. Throughout his career, Peter has been supported by his beautiful and talented family, including wife Goretti, who's here today, and of course his 2 children, Jamie and Daniel. Appropriately, on this National Agriculture Day, congratulations, Peter, on your life membership, and thank you for your great contribution to the club and rural journalism over many years. Can you please welcome Peter Lewis to the stage? Do you want me to say anything? Go for it. Now I've got a bell here, Peter.
Yeah. Look, thanks, Brendan. You actually made my career sound a lot better than it actually was. I'm very indebted to the club, to James and the club committee. And when I say that, I mean it honestly. I owe them money. I actually might hold the record for the tardiest payment of membership fees in the club's 50-year history. So I figured when they told me about it that life membership would simply be a lot, so much more administratively easier for the club to, and the club's bean counters to deal with. I'm quite chuffed by it though. I thoroughly enjoyed my connection with the Rural Press Club going back to, it's nearly 25 years. I enjoyed my time with the club here. I enjoyed my time with the national body, the ACAJ, and through our membership of the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists. I got to work with some terrific people, I've got to say, and stood on the shoulders of those people, some of whom, of course, are here today and whom you have similarly recognised. Wonderful colleagues, treasured friendships, and I think the important thing to remember is, make no mistake, this club is a mighty force for good in the state of Queensland, holding up truth to power every bit as well as Rick Britton's braces, and cooking up events as tasty and nutritious as Flo Bielka-Peterson's pumpkin scones. The club itself has been a great storyteller in its own right, and a very, very useful conversation starter on the important issues, ideas and innovations in agriculture in this state. Very importantly, through its awards, it's been a champion of the best and brightest in our business, and it gives many of them the opportunity to travel around the world and connect with very like-minded souls, which I think is probably one of the noblest activities that the club undertakes in the course of a calendar year. There's never been a greater time, frankly, for plain speaking and common sense when it comes to the issues of food and fibre. Probably never more in the club's 50-year history than right now. Because from where I sit, there's an awful lot of stupid around in terms of the debates over what we eat and what we wear. And it's very important that clubs like this, and once again, it has to be acknowledged, the Rural Press Club of Queensland is not just one of the most successful clubs of its kind in this country, it's actually one of the most successful in the world. People around the world look at the numbers of people who come to our events, the calibre of the guests that come to these events, the people who have contributed over a long period, and say it is quite remarkable. So the club should be extraordinarily proud of its 50-year history, where it came from, how it's being sustained and where it is right now. It is a tremendous thing, and the small, tiny part that I played in it, I'm extraordinarily proud of it. Now, Brendan, I cannot let this occasion pass without reminding you of how Hall of Famer and my former ABC colleague Kerry Lonergan reacted to being honoured by the club some years ago. And he said, and I quote, "Journalist citations and achievement awards like this are a little bit like hemorrhoids. Sooner or later, every arsehole gets one." And you thought I had a way with words. Brendan, I accept the award in the spirit with which it was intended and not the way Kerry interpreted it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. I think it's time to update the bio. We probably don't need to talk about what we did at school these days with every year that goes past. But thank you very much, Mark, for that kind introduction. And first of all, everyone, happy National Agriculture Day. As those of you who were at the QFF breakfast this morning will know, they were my parting words to my wife when I left home at 6:15 this morning. She just rolled her eyes, as she does most days when I leave early to go to work. But I can tell you, as Fran has indicated, that there's absolutely nowhere I would rather spend National Agriculture Day than in my hometown and my home state of Brisbane in Queensland. So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you here to celebrate. As you would know, the Jagera and Turrbal people were Brisbane's first farmers, many thousands of years ago, or going back thousands of years, caring for the land in a sustainable manner while providing food and fibre for their families for tens of thousands of years. And we're gathering today on their lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge Tony Perrott is here. There's many industry leaders from across the ag sector, so it's good to see all of you. And I'd also like to thank the committee of the Queensland Rural Press Club for their kind invitation to address you all here today. As some of you may remember, the last time I addressed or was involved in a Rural Press Club event was during the election campaign, where I was debating Senator James McGrath, but I'm expecting that today will be a little less confrontational. Although that was very prescient of the Rural Press Club to get me involved, because it meant that I had a Rural Press Club tie before I became Agriculture Minister. So thank you for thinking ahead that way. I want to pay tribute to the really important role that the Rural Press Club plays, and our media generally, here in Queensland, in elevating issues of concern, particularly to rural and regional Queensland. And whether it's the Queensland Country Life, Beef Central, the NQ Register, the Longreach Leader, the ABC Rural Report, Queensland Country Hour, or even the Batuta Advocate. The reach and impact of your reporting on our way of life is immense. As I said to Ali from Country Hour this morning when we did an interview, I'm constantly amazed by the number of text messages or phone calls I get every time I do Country Hour in particular. Whether I'm here in Queensland or I was in South Australia through the week doing it there as well. So constantly getting text messages from the most unlikely people saying, "Oh, Murray, I heard you on Country Hour." You know, and some of them are even complimentary occasionally when they send those text messages. So it shows the impact that all of the media in our rural sector, and Charlie, I shouldn't miss the Australian as well because you do a good job there, It shows the reach that all of you have on public policy and our rural communities, and I think it's really important to celebrate that work. Can I also just join with everyone else in paying tribute to Pete Lewis? His work with the ABC, particularly in rural news, I know that all of you have listened to and enjoyed for many years. And his work in the rural media space generally has promoted and profiled this important industry to the wider community. I've met Pete previously, even before becoming the Minister, at ag conferences in Darwin, in Rocky and other places as well. And that shows you the level of influence that he's had on the rural media scene right across our country. So Pete, congratulations from me personally on your life membership. It's very well deserved. Now, of course, every day for me as the Agriculture Minister is National Agriculture Day, but today is an opportunity for the national spotlight to be on this great industry, which is an essential part of Australian identity, our economy and our way of life. This is my first formal speech to the Queensland Rural Press Club, certainly as Agriculture Minister. And can I say how proud I am to be representing your industry in our new government and in the federal cabinet. But I'm also really proud to be representing Queensland more generally and the Queensland ag sector in particular around the cabinet table. As you heard from Fran in her introduction this morning with some of those, or this afternoon with some of those statistics, Queensland punches well above our weight when it comes to agricultural production across a very broad range of commodities. And I think it's fair to say also that Queensland has become quite the political powerhouse in Canberra at the moment. Because I'm one of 3 ministers, including the man who holds the national purse strings in Canberra. We have the Speaker in the House of Representatives, an Assistant Minister, a Special Envoy as well, and of course as well we have the leaders of the 2 opposition parties, roles that I think they're very well qualified to keep for a very long time. As many of you know, I do have strong family ties to regional Queensland as well, with my father growing up on a dairy farm on the Serena Range just outside on the Serena Range just outside Mackay, and my mum also spent quite a bit of her childhood in dairy farms on the Darling Downs as well. And as you heard from Mark, my career to this point has led me to all parts of this state, whether as a lawyer, a policymaker, a state MP or an opposition senator over the last few years. And why I mention that is not, for a bit of backslapping, but I think that it has enabled me to develop some really strong ties with regional and rural Queensland and the ag sector in particular. And I can assure you that I certainly know the difference between Yeppoon and Yeppen, having been there only a couple of weeks ago. I hope you've noticed that I've made a very concerted effort since taking on this role to spend as much time in regional Queensland as possible, while also, of course, having to spend a lot of time in flooded areas right across the country. And I continue to really enjoy that and the opportunity to meet with producers, farm workers and processors on the ground. My first farm visit as the Agriculture Minister was to Emerald, where I visited Ross Burnett's cotton farm, and I met the inspiring Bate family, who have obviously developed that incredible ag tech under the banner of Swarm Farm. I've met with vegetable growers in the Lockyer Valley who were impacted by the floods earlier this year, and more recently I've been back to Rockhampton a couple of times, once with the Prime Minister on Raglan Cattle Station, and more recently back to the Gracemere Sale Yards to announce some extra funding for the next Beef Australia event in 2024. And more recently, still, I've visited the Brisbane markets in Rockley with my colleague Graham Perrott to get a better understanding of some of the issues facing fruit and veg wholesalers. So I'm doing as much as I possibly can to continue getting out and about while also having to duck down to Western New South Wales or Victoria for floods every other week. And I've said before that I'm really conscious that I'm very fortunate to take on this role as the Agriculture Minister at what is, on the whole, a pretty good time for our agriculture sector here in Australia, and particularly here in Queensland, where we've had 3 consecutive years of above average rainfall. While that does provide its challenges, especially to individual farmers, I can certainly tell you that I'd rather be the Ag Minister now than in the middle of a long drought, and other people have obviously had that situation to deal with. And as I say, I recognise that there are still farmers in Queensland who've been doing it tough from those circumstances, but on the whole, the industry is producing more and exporting more. You may have seen yesterday that ABARES, the Federal Department's Economic Forecasting Agency, released a document entitled Agriculture in Australia, Understanding the Recent Success. And what ABARES was saying in that document was that Australian agriculture has gone from 3 years of drought to reaching new heights in 2020-21, and then it went on to achieve even greater things in 2021-22, setting new industry records with gross value of production approaching $85 billion. And they also have found that many agricultural regions had transitioned from very poor circumstances to very good conditions within the span of a single season. And this, of course, has been combined with the pretty rare phenomenon of very high and increasing commodity prices for almost all of our major agricultural products. But we do recognise there are many challenges still facing the sector, and I do intend to spend a bit of time working through some of those. And with, I think, significant international and domestic market uncertainty, making the right investments now will be key in protecting the sector from threats and guiding its future growth. And I guess that's sort of my theme in talking to you today, and it was our theme when we presented the agriculture budget, is that the way I'm approaching this portfolio is to ensure that what I can do is help to protect this sector from some of its threats and to grow it as well. We shouldn't be just doing one or the other. We need to be doing both at the same time. And I did think that you saw a little bit of that from our first budget, which was handed down last month by my fellow Queenslander, Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Now, that was a budget which very deliberately tried to take into account the circumstances that everyday people are facing at the moment, dealing with a range of cost of living issues, with a clear focus on improving our skills, health and aged care systems, as well as investing in job-creating infrastructure projects. And of course, that's while all at the same time trying to get our nation's finances back on track from what we've seen over the last few years. And like our national economy, we very much acknowledge right across the cabinet table that our farm sector has some very significant challenges that it's dealing with, despite the fact that, as I say, prices are generally pretty high and growing conditions on the whole are pretty good. As many of you know, much better than me, farmers are paying more for fertilisers, fuel and other inputs. Farm workers' interest rates are going up. Rural Australians continue to need better access to good quality healthcare and aged care. And our rural industries need access to good infrastructure to help their businesses grow. And like many household budgets right around the country, we've had to really carefully consider our spending in this year's budget and make sure that it delivers value for money. That at times required some difficult decisions, and there have been some people who've been critical of those decisions, and I understand that. But the reality is that the situation that both the federal budget's in and our national economy means that we really did have to undertake some reprioritisation of what are precious public funds to focus on what's really needed now. I think that's what good governments do, and that's what we intend to continue doing. There's no doubt that whether it be here in Brisbane, rural parts of Queensland or right across the country, people are doing it tough. And our budget was very directed towards delivering cost of living relief. And I think that will benefit thousands of people right across rural and regional Queensland. Some of you may have heard me say in other speeches that I've given that, of course, while my primary role as the Agriculture Minister is to focus on the needs of the sector, I also see myself as a bit of a representative within the Cabinet of rural and regional Australia. And if you go into rural and regional Australia, as I know that many of you do, some people will talk to you about farm prices or yields or things like that. Some people, the very first thing they'll want to talk to you about is the fact they can't get to see a GP. So I think it's important to make sure that we still focus on some of those issues as well. But aside from those other more general things that we're trying to do through the budget, what we also did was try to give people a bit of an insight into what our government's priorities are for your sector in agriculture. And it was increasing funding to strengthen our biosecurity systems that was our absolute number one priority. And as I say, that did involve some difficult decisions to cancel some existing programs in order to find the money necessary to make our biosecurity system as strong as it possibly could be. Now, you all know that a strong biosecurity system is absolutely vital in maintaining a strong agriculture sector. And the presence of both foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease in Indonesia this year presents a heightened risk of a large incursion in Australia. They're not the only things we need to worry about. Varroa mite and a range of plant diseases like capra beetle or banana freckle also threaten a range of Australian and Queensland producers. And I think it's worth acknowledging that given that we all live in Australia's north, there are particular risks of transmission from a biosecurity perspective that we need to take additional action on. So in response to those threats, I can honestly tell you that we have now deployed our country's strongest ever biosecurity response. We've supported our Indo-Pacific neighbours, we've toughened our legislation, and there'll be more happening in Parliament over the next couple of weeks on that front. We've stress tested our preparedness. We've aligned ourselves carefully with state and territory partners in the nation's first ever national biosecurity strategy. I think that it is always worth repeating that Australia remains free of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. There were some media outlets, none of which I'm sure are here today, who sort of got it a bit wrong about what was going on with foot and mouth disease. I'm always at pains to point out both here and overseas that we are free of those diseases. But the last few months have illustrated the need for a biosecurity system which is contemporary and up to scratch for the challenges we now face. And to that end, I'm pleased to say that if there was one centrepiece in our agriculture budget, it was an investment of $134 million to bolster our biosecurity system against the immediate threat of these diseases. Some of you may remember that we went to the election with a commitment about delivering a long-term sustainable funding arrangements for biosecurity, something that industry has been calling for a very long time. And we're now working on that, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but we see that $134 million commitment in this year's budget as a serious down payment on making sure that we do have that sustainable long-term biosecurity funding that the country needs. We're going to be having a bit more to say about the longer-term plan and that sustainable biosecurity funding package in the future, but we're going to do it after we properly consult with the industry and a range of other stakeholders. We have seen some other attempts to do big things in the biosecurity space that have ended up falling flat because of inadequate consultation, and we don't intend to do that now that we're in office. That consultation around sustainable biosecurity funding is now underway, and I encourage you all to participate by going to our department's website, and they've got helpfully a Have Your Say website where all of you can put in your views about what our biosecurity system should look like into the future, what we need to be doing more of, what we could stop doing, and importantly, how we should pay for it. That's where the difficult conversations tend to emerge, I find. Now, the biosecurity investments that we're making right now, though, mean that we're not going to be dropping our guard while we're working on this longer-term package. And I know that people aren't talking quite as much in the general community about foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease at the moment as they were a few months back. But our focus on these issues has only sharpened over the last few months. And that's why today I'm proud to announce two grants that have been awarded to Meat and Livestock Australia and LiveCorp, which will further support Indonesia's biosecurity response to foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. Those diseases have not gone away in Indonesia. We're working very collaboratively with their government to do everything we possibly can to help them bring that outbreak under control, and these two new grants are a further example of that. I caught up with Troy Setter just before lunch, and I know it wasn't that long ago that Troy was on this stage or another stage around Brisbane at the Rural Press Club, talking about what LiveCorp was doing to provide information about the great work that they're doing to prevent the spread of these diseases within and beyond Indonesia. And I guess what we're trying to do as a government is to help the efforts of LiveCorp, MLA and other groups by backing industry in. And that's why these grants involve about $1.2 million being provided to LiveCorp for a livestock export industry, FMD and LSD vaccine support and implementation program. Wow, what a mouthful that is. And an additional $550,000 to MLA for an Indonesia biosecurity support project. The first 6 to 12 months of the MLA project will include an in-country risk assessment and mitigation plan, development of feedlot manuals and training delivery on biosecurity and emergency response in Indonesia. This MLA project is already underway, and I know we've got people from MLA in the audience today. with industry contributing $1 million to what is overall a $2.1 million project. The LiveCourt project will partially reimburse the cost of FMD and LSD vaccine programs used for buffer zone vaccination, focusing on encouraging vaccination of susceptible species surrounding feedlots and facilities right across Indonesia, and supporting the welfare of smallholders within these communities. The Indonesian farming system is a little bit different to what you find in Queensland, so working with those feedlots at one end of the spectrum and the smallholders at the other is a really important joined-up approach. The other key component of the biosecurity package that we took to the budget this year is a big new investment in livestock traceability. Improving traceability both on and off farm provides transparency in the supply chain and reassurance for consumers, and of course it enhances our biosecurity as well. Now, I recognise that in Queensland in particular there have been some very big improvements in traceability in some livestock industries, but sorting out traceability for sheep and goats in our country has been a bit of a holy grail that has eluded all governments for a very long time. But I'm really pleased to be able to say that a really cooperative approach that we've tried to develop with our state and territory counterparts as ministers is starting to see some real progress on this front. We're now working with industry towards mandatory implementation of national individual electronic tagging for sheep and goats in each jurisdiction by the 1st of January 2025. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that every single sheep and goat and lamb in the country will have an ear tag by the 1st of January 2025, but we want to see it begin in every part of the country by that date. And that is a fairly ambitious goal when you think about the history of this issue. And we're really serious about seeing that commitment realised. That's why in the budget we invested $46.7 million to support continuous improvement in our livestock traceability systems. That's double the commitment that was made by the former government in their March budget, and I think that it's a huge signal to states, territories and industry that we're absolutely serious about driving these reforms further as quickly as we possibly can. So by maintaining our world-class system and ensuring that we can recover quickly from any disease incursions, we'll be doing a lot, I think, to work with the agriculture sector. On a human level, I think COVID-19 has taught all of us the benefits of tracking individuals to slow the spread of infectious disease, especially at that point before we had vaccines readily available. And I think that we can apply these lessons to protect our livestock industries, while also at the same time using traceability to shore up our trade opportunities and give consumers the information that they increasingly want about the food that they're consuming. Industry has told us for many years that they want to see reform and investment on traceability, and we're listening and we're acting. Now, the other issue which I know is very front of mind for a lot of people in regional Australia right now is our response to natural disasters. I've obviously got a dual interest in this, somehow choosing to take on the roles of agriculture during a biosecurity crisis and emergency management in the third consecutive La Nina. Now, our primary producers are obviously on the front line of almost every fire, cyclone, hailstorm or flood that we see around the country. We've obviously seen that here in Queensland over recent years, and over the last week we've again seen those devastating floods continue in an ongoing manner to impact on places in central West New South Wales. I've been in Forbes recently in central West New South Wales, and there were people there who were telling me that they were already facing their 5th and 6th flood just this year. That would be probably 3 or 4 weeks ago that I was there, and of course there have been more floods since that time as well. And not surprisingly, I think what that means is that people in these regional communities are really tired. The SES volunteers that you meet are exhausted, and that's why we've managed to work with the New South Wales government and overseas governments to bring in reinforcements from New Zealand and Singapore to give people a bit of respite, which they desperately need. Now, just even in the last few weeks, I've met with farmers and communities everywhere from Western New South Wales to Northern Victoria, northwest Tasmania as well. And what they've all been telling me is that they're suffering major crop losses and very significant damage to roads and infrastructure, which of course affects their ability to get product to market. Now, I'm very keen to make sure that people know that we're still stepping up when it comes to recovery support, and already we will have provided billions of dollars in recovery support just this calendar year. Of course, along with the states that are helping with that as well, and that sort of support will continue. But as a new government, one of the things that we want to change is how we deal with natural disasters and move away just from reacting to preventing and preparing a lot better as a country. And the reality is that with climate change delivering more frequent and more intense natural disasters, we do need to be much better prepared than we have been in past years for the natural disasters that we know are coming. And that's why our government is investing up to $1 billion over the next 5 years in a new disaster ready fund. And this was also announced in this year's budget. And the purpose of that fund is to mitigate the impacts of disasters by building things like flood levees, drainage improvements, bushfire evacuation centres, cyclone shelters, seawalls. It'll be different things in different parts of the country. But what we need to do is see that serious investment, hopefully matched by states, territories and local governments, so that we can really make a dent in the backlog that we've got in mitigation projects. And if we can do that, what that means is that we can reduce the risk of these natural disasters rather than always just responding after things have happened. It would of course be remiss of me to come to the Rural Press Club and not talk about a couple of current events that are touching on agriculture. And I've found this week, as I've been talking to people, that there's been no bigger news event this week than Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Sadly, the fact is that Australian agriculture, fisheries and forestry have paid a very heavy price for the deterioration in our relationship with our country's major trading partner. And our government has been consistent that we want to see these trade blockages removed. That is in both Australia's interest and China's interest. And of course, we would prefer to resolve these trade blockages through sensible and mature discussion. Now, I know that there is really great interest in the agriculture sector about that meeting that occurred this week and what it means going forward. And I spoke to the PM shortly after he had that meeting and reflected to him how important it was to the agriculture industry in particular. And I think that that is a very positive step, to be having a meeting of our two countries' leaders for the first time since 2016. And I think, there can be no doubt that the effort that our government has been putting in to renewing a mature engagement in the Asia-Pacific region is beginning to repair some of the relationships that we had seen be damaged over the last few years. Now, the Prime Minister has made it very clear that it's not in our country's interest to not have any dialogue with our major trading partner. I know that many companies have been able to maintain that sort of dialogue, but at a federal government level in particular, it just hasn't been possible for quite some time. But as excited and hopeful as many of us are about that meeting having occurred, I think it's important to recognise that there is still a long way to go. I heard Jennifer Westacott from the BCA on the radio this morning. It was the first step in a series of steps. And we have made clear that we will always stand up for Australia's values and our national interest. But it is a very good step. Now, the other major international event that occurred this week and has a big impact on agriculture is, of course, the COP27 meeting in Egypt. And I think it was terrific to see Australian agriculture represented on the global stage by our National Farmers Federation alongside our Climate Change and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen. Now, I've said before that Australia's agriculture industry, I think, has been waiting for federal leadership that would join and back in the industry's own endeavours to tackle climate change. And why wouldn't the industry feel that way when you consider that ABARES research that was released last year showed that climate change is costing every farm in Australia on average around $30,000 per year in terms of lost profitability and lost production. I think that farmers, processors and the industry generally moved on from the climate wars that we've seen in this country quite some time ago. And I'm very pleased to say that we finally have a government in Canberra who's prepared to work with the industry to take these issues forward. I think the best early example of that is something that you might have seen in the news over the last month. Australia has now joined more than 120 other countries around the world in signing on to the Global Methane Pledge. And as I said in many, many interviews, contrary to what we were all being told about 12 months ago about meaning that it's going to have to involve shooting livestock and reducing herd sizes, in actual fact, what this pledge is a non-binding, collective, global agreement to work together to bring down emissions from methane by 30% by 2030. It doesn't involve a binding target for any particular country. It doesn't require any country to go out and shoot every cow. What it requires is a bit of common sense and working together with other countries. And I'm pleased that, unlike what we saw from certain other countries, maybe including over the ditch, Ag was at the table when our government was considering this move. And what that meant was that the sector achieved an outcome that not only champions the work that you've been doing for quite some time to reduce emissions, but also invests in incentives to reduce emissions further, rather than imposes punitive measures like taxes or levies. And those sort of things that we've committed to in recent weeks are the $5 million in ag-specific research to help reduce methane emissions, and the $8 million that we committed in the budget towards the further commercialisation of seaweed as a low-emission feed supplement. And I want to commend the work that many of the peak bodies, whether it be the NFF or RMAC or some of the Queensland-based bodies, for being part of that process. I know some of these things have been difficult for people to work through, and I know that not everyone is on board all of the time. But through careful, respectful collaboration, we achieved a good outcome for the industry and also for the environment. And of course, importantly, one of the reasons we need to keep doing these things is that it keeps the export door open with our major trader partners who are expecting a higher and higher level of sustainability from our product. I think also it's worth just noting the incredible level of innovation that we're seeing within the industry. I could give you many examples, but I don't want to go on too much longer about that. But I did want to particularly mention Australian Country Choice and what they're doing. I was out with Anthony and his team recently in Murarrie looking at the work they're doing to improve their value adding while also driving agricultural education in a really big way. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. The only other thing I just wanted to mention before concluding as a priority is something that I know that everyone in the industry is talking about, and that's workforce shortages. It's something that's raised with me everywhere I go, but frankly, let's face it, it's not just the agriculture industry who's been facing these workforce shortages. I suspect the fabulous team here at Rydges, who are looking after us today, could probably do with a few more people helping out, because hospitality's been hit and pretty much every industry has as well. But I do want to recognise that the ag industry has faced some particular challenges in this regard, and they're not new challenges. They've been around for a number of years, albeit they did get worse through COVID. And I'm pleased to be able to tell you that we are taking this issue seriously and making it a very big priority. One of the outcomes of the Jobs and Skills Summit that our government held a few weeks back was the creation of a tripartite group bringing together agriculture employer groups, unions and government to actually sit down and work through some of these issues in a collaborative, constructive manner, rather than everyone being in their trenches, which is what we've seen a lot of in years gone by. And that working group has now met twice. It's putting up some really good suggestions around training, around skills, around migration, and I'm hopeful that it will produce some very good outcomes before too long. But I don't want to let you think that nothing is going to be happening until some roundtable reports. There have been already some commitments that our government's made which should really start benefiting the agriculture sector in terms of workforce, whether that be beefing up the PALM scheme. We've actually got more Pacific Island workers in Australia now than we've ever had before. That's gone up by several thousand in recent years. The backpacker numbers are increasing, albeit off a low base. We're putting in a lot of work to clear the terrible backlog of visa applications that existed when we took office. That backlog had blown out to about nearly a million visa applications that were waiting to be processed. We've now been able to bring that down to 800-odd thousand, and we have every intention of trying to get it down a lot lower still. But as some of you might have heard me say at the QFF breakfast this morning, I do think it's important also to acknowledge that we don't just fix our workforce issues by bringing people in from overseas. That is an important part of it, and that's something we're working on. But we've also got to do a lot better, I think, about training up local people and providing the kind of training opportunities needed in rural areas, in particular for some of the high-skilled and semi-skilled jobs that we see emerging even faster in this industry. So I think there is a lot of work to be done to get the workforce that the ag sector needs, but we've made a good start, I think, and there's a lot more to come. I think I've said enough then about priorities, and I just want to conclude by saying that the importance of agriculture to our economy, to our society, and to our place in the world cannot be overstated. The Prime Minister gets it, and that's why he's raised agricultural trade and food security as top priorities in the meetings that he's been having with world leaders at the various summits he's been at over the last week or two in Southeast Asia. The Treasurer gets it, not just because he's a Queenslander, although that doesn't go astray, but he's also someone who understands the importance of this industry to our nation's bottom line. And I certainly get it as your representative, both in Cabinet, in the Federal Parliament and in the wider community. And as I've said before, I see it very much as part of my role to be an advocate for this industry and the amazing things that it's doing, whether it be on workforce, on sustainability, on production measures, on trade. I want to be an advocate for that in the wider community and take the impression and the image that agriculture has to an even higher level and to make it an industry that the entire Australian community is proud of, not just the people who work on it. So as you can tell, I'm pretty excited about what lies ahead and I look forward to working with all of you to get it done. Thank you. Sure. And now for the hard part with the journos.
We'll now take questions from the room. Thank you.
Minister, I think for far too long that the agriculture industry has fallen under the radar has had the full recognition of the benefits that we supply to Australian and overseas farmers. But since COVID, as a dairy industry would say, I think the cream's come to the top. Especially when our farmers in Australia don't receive any subsidies like the USA and EU. My question to you is, have you seen in your short period of time international agricultural companies want to come and invest in Australia?
Hi Brad, good to see you again. I think we last caught up at the ECA a few weeks back. Yeah, I think there's obviously interest in investing in Australian agriculture, and I note some of the representatives from one of the companies that you're sitting with is having some pretty big, interesting things happening in terms of investment at the moment as well from overseas, as is the case for many of the other tables here today. Our position on foreign investment is that we welcome it, of course. And you know, I think it is a healthy thing to have overseas investment in what we produce here in Australia. It does bring extraordinary levels of capital and opportunities to our agriculture industry. That's not to say that we'll just accept anything and on any conditions. There's obviously a strong foreign investment review board process that people have got to go through, and we intend to keep that working in a very serious manner. But I think that especially as the world is beginning to open up again, we're going to see increasing interest from whether it be from Southeast Asia, Europe, the US, in continuing to invest in Australian agriculture.
Thank you, Mark. It was a fantastic address. I'm particularly interested in labour in agriculture. And the success of the farm system and the PLS system. But what's blocking the ASEAN system? What makes it unattractive? Why did the government cancel it? Could you provide some commentary on how it would go forward?
Sure. The ASEAN system, otherwise known as the Ag Visa proposal, that's what you're talking about? Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of our criticisms of the Ag Visa was that for all the talk we heard about it, it didn't deliver a single worker. So there was a lot of hype for a very long period of time about what it would do, but you know, you would have heard us say about the former government they were pretty good at making announcements, not always necessarily on the follow-through. And what we wanted to do was to really focus on systems that had a history of working, and the PALM scheme and the seasonal worker program scheme have a very strong record of delivering the workers that make a big difference on Australian farms. They also have a very strong layer of worker protection in them as well, and that was important to us too. But I have heard the feedback, obviously, from farmers that as much as they welcome the PALM scheme, it's not going to meet every need. And particularly some of the people who had come in from other countries sometimes had the qualifications or the farm experience that was very useful for some of the semi-skilled and high-skilled jobs that happen on farms. And I guess one of my messages to farmers and farm groups has been that there's nothing stopping people bringing in people from overseas and other countries through the myriad of other visa schemes that we already have in place. It may be that those visa schemes aren't working as effectively as they need to for the agriculture sector, and I've already started having discussions with the industry about what we could be doing to make those visa schemes work better. But I guess our view was that we didn't necessarily need an ag-specific visa to address the workforce shortages. We needed to make better use of the schemes that we already have in place including the Pacific Labour Scheme and also the other range of visa programs that we have. But I mean, we absolutely recognise that it's a huge issue for ag. I've met too many farmers who just don't have the workers they need to get their crops in or anything else. And that's why I suppose we're trying to take a broad approach to it in the thing about training up Australians, providing fee-free TAFE places for people in agriculture, while looking at the PALM scheme and other visa programs as well.
Yes. Mr. Mocker and Michael, great to see you in Queensland on National Ag Day. My question is about telling our story on the international stage.
Yep.
You touched on methane on COP27 and the great story we have. You also mentioned that our fellows across the ditch, friends across the ditch, have put in place a punitive methane tax recently, which tells a bad story of agriculture. So I'm really interested in comments from you about the new government's view about that storytelling, how you take it to COP27 and ensure we don't go down that negative path that unfortunately we've seen across New Zealand.
Yeah, I've talked, good to see you again, Michael. I've talked particularly with Fiona Simpson and Tony Marr at the NFF, and also some of the Queensland-based bodies about what we can do to really strengthen Australian agriculture's reputation internationally. And I think we're all sort of watching what's happening in the EU around their approach to sustainability with a little bit of caution. And one of the things that is clear to me is that there's often a misconception in other parts of the world about what Australian agriculture actually does. To be blunt, I do think that some of the policy changes that we've seen at the national level around emissions targets have sent a very strong signal to the world about where Australia's at on climate change more generally. But I think there's still some work to be done in demonstrating to the rest of the world how highly efficient, how highly sustainable Australian agriculture actually is. I think sometimes people overseas have looked at what our national policy regimes have been and have then inferred that means that Australian agriculture are wreckers as well. And I don't think that's the case. I think we've got an excellent story to tell, and frankly I think we've got to tell it, because if we don't tell it, that is going to put some of our trading markets in jeopardy. So there's a lot of thinking going into that at the moment. Provided these floods have a little bit of a break, I'm hoping to go to the Green Week conference in Berlin in January. And that's, as some of you might know, that's a massive agricultural trade show, particularly with a sustainability focus. And I intend to have as many meetings as I possibly can while I'm over there with ministers from other governments to tell the very positive story about Australian agriculture. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no. Stephanie Hunt from HQ Plantations. Stephanie Hunt from HQ Plantations. We are the second largest softwood grower in Australia, the largest pine plantation grower in Queensland. Approximately 80% of all of the domestic timber used in the construction industry, structural timber in Australia, in Queensland rather, is supplied by us. We have a resource shortage coming from 2032 to 2042. And I guess my question to you is just what is happening on a national level to support the forest growing industry?
Thanks, Stephanie. As someone who is just completing a very, very, very long home renovation, I can tell you I have sympathy for the timber supply shortage issue that our country is facing even now, let alone the future. You might be familiar, we made a number of election commitments that we then delivered funding for in the budget in the forestry space, because you're right, I feel like there's two reasons to really get cracking on forestry and increasing the number of plantations in particular. And that's one, the timber shortage, but two, the incredible difference that forestry can make to our carbon challenges. There's a really obvious role for forestry there to play, and we want to get behind that. So some of the things we took to the election were, I think it was in the order of about $80 to $90 million to expand the plantation estate right across the country. We're obviously also investing a lot in training of workforce for forestry and really trying to get behind some of the more efficient manufacturing and production of timber as well. Obviously, if we can harness the very most from every particular tree, that's an efficient use of that tree and enables us to monetise as much as possible rather than seeing too much waste. But there's probably about 5 or 6 other commitments that we made in the forestry space. Removing the water rule, which had existed under the former government and was a bit of a barrier to plantations happening. I think, again, what was that, sorry? What's that, sorry? It hasn't been, well, it's at a national level it hasn't been removed yet, but we've made a commitment to do so. Because as I understand it, as I say, that was quite a barrier to plantation development. And of course, you know, there's a win-win here for people in forestry and farming around carbon markets as well. And, you know, the feedback I've had from a lot of farmers is that the existing carbon markets are just a bit too complex and not very easy to use. And we're obviously doing a review about that at the moment, which is hopefully going to come up with a system which is more easy to use and provides farmers with income streams to grow more trees, which is again a great option for environmental benefits, economic wins for farmers, and where we're talking about using them ultimately for plantation timber, there's a good forestry outcome there as well.
Well, we'd certainly like to see some of that expansion of the plantation estate happens here in Queensland.
Me too, me too. Happy to keep talking with you about that.
Very good, thank you.
Jo Shepherd from the Queensland Farmers Federation. Nice to see you again, Minister.
It's been hours, Jo. It's been hours.
Yes. Global supply chain disruptions have wreaked havoc with not just agriculture but most businesses around the world. And I know there's a lot of unknowns ahead still, but I was just interested to hear what the federal government's line of sight is in terms of what we can expect in that space next year.
Look, I think it's still a bit of an uncertain environment, and I'll be honest with you, as probably some people in the room know, there have been some serious issues around cargo clearances at our ports as well, and where we've got teams working on that from a biosecurity perspective to try to get that sort of stuff moving along better as well. I mean, I think it's reasonable to expect that the supply chain interruptions we've seen over the last few years will continue to improve. As I say, as the rest of the country opens up, although, you know, China is still taking a pretty firm approach to its COVID management practices, which is going to have some issues around supply chains. But I certainly hope that will improve. The other thing I should mention, and I didn't do it this morning at the breakfast, was I know there's interest in what more we can be doing about doing more manufacturing onshore, whether it be about fertiliser or other things as well that benefit farms. And one of the other commitments we took to the election was the establishment of a new National Reconstruction Fund, which will have $15 billion in it to co-invest with industry about basically modernising and rebuilding our manufacturing industry. We all saw through COVID that we were caught short with the decline of our manufacturing sector, that there were all sorts of things we needed and we couldn't get readily because of those supply chain interruptions. It's a $15 billion fund. We've hived off $500 million of it specifically for manufacturing in agriculture, food and fibre. Theoretically, it could be looking at co-investing with business around domestic manufacturing of fertiliser. It could be doing things around ag tech more generally. So I think that's not something that's going to happen in the next 12 months necessarily, but I think that's got to be part of the story longer term as well, is building that sovereign capability, including for agriculture.
Kate Bandel from 10 News. You spoke about the Prime Minister's recent conversations with China and re-engaging that diplomacy and how that affects trade deals. We're also hearing a lot at the moment about the potential increase of defence spending and the need for being transparent with the Australian public. Is it not time that we show that same honesty and more frank conversations with the Australian public about how that's connected with our ag industry, and particularly the potential increase of spending that the industry will need on the back of all of these natural disasters domestically?
So just so I understand, you're asking we should be more upfront with people about the connection between national security spending and agricultural trade? Okay. Look, I think I'm going to take a punt that what you're getting at is China in general. And I mean, what we've said is that, as I said in the speech, that we want to have a respectful, honest relationship with China that stabilises things. And we do want to see some of those trade blockages lifted, and the Prime Minister made that very clear in his meeting with China the other night. But I don't think, and we've also said we're going to be very firm about standing up for our values, we're not going to sacrifice national security, all of those kind of things. But I guess what I see when I look around the world is that there are other countries who've been able to have a mature, very frank relationship with China, and where they disagree on things quite firmly at times, but continue to maintain a trade relationship. And I guess I'm thinking of countries like Japan and South Korea, which are, you know, in the neighbourhood for China. And I sort of think that if we approach it with the same spirit about being very clear about what we want and very clear about what we stand for and being respectful of differences, that does open the way to that kind of dialogue. And so I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time on these things. I think you can do what you need to do as a country from a national security perspective, wherever that threat might come from, while at the same time building that trade relationship so that our agricultural producers can get back to earning the kind of premium prices they were a few years ago. Hopefully that answers the question.
Hi, Senator. Scott from Red Earth Energy Storage, not a journalist, so you can be a bit more liberal in your response. Feel free. Firstly, thanks for the address. Very thorough, which is great. When you spoke on biosecurity, was fantastic. I think that's essential. We need to move forward. Also on your recovery support and being prepared for your disaster relief. I was just wondering, you mentioned the sustainability in the future. What are your plans? And it could be a decade, 2 decades, but when we're looking at our national electricity grid, the failures that are happening, what we saw up in Callide, especially a fringe of grid, which will affect all agriculture, forestry right away through, and emergency relief, what we're seeing in Forbes.
Yep.
What are your plans moving forward with that? And not sort of the greenwashing as everyone else says, that are actual plans moving forward?
About renewables in particular?
Renewables,
yeah.
Bacteria, both disaster, fringe of grid, and energy security.
Sure. Well, I guess the starting point for our government is that we're going to need more energy in the future, and the cheapest way to supply that in the future is through renewable power. And it doesn't make sense to choose expensive options that in some cases the technology is quite a way down the track before it can really be built to meet our power needs, which are increasingly urgent. So you may have seen, again, we took a package to the election, the Powering Australia policy, which was about government, again, co-investing around building the kind of transmission grid that we need right around the country so that we can plug in all of those solar and wind developments that people want to build, especially in places like regional Queensland. So I think that we can expect to see over the coming years some very big investment in rural Queensland and rural Australia in those sorts of technologies. And the good thing about that is that they produce spin-off jobs for some of those regional areas, whether it be the construction initially, the maintenance, or ultimately bringing down the price of power. And that's another key ingredient to getting this manufacturing industry rebuilt again. Now that won't necessarily be easy. A, it costs a lot of money. B, there's got to be changes made to the regulatory system, and C, I'm very conscious that there's some real thought that is going to need to go into land access on agricultural land for how and where these sorts of transmission lines and other infrastructure are built. I was talking about that with Joe this morning. So there's a lot to work through, but that's the end goal, is to massively expand our renewable energy network, especially to cope with the fact that some of our existing power stations are going to come offline in the years ahead, and we need replacement power, and we need more than what we've got at the moment. So there's a really big agenda there, and I'll be happy to talk with you some further about it.
Thank you, Senator. Are we on?
Hello. Yeah, Pete Lewis.
I think we know who you are.
Look, the Batuta advocate has picked up your point about the Pacific Islanders and the visa scheme. They were hoping that you might be able to skew it just a little between now and the Rugby World Cup.
I was wondering about that.
So that we can get above average rugby players in that mix of people.
Maybe we need to invite the Samoan Rugby League team to Australia for the next few days or so and just take them out of action, you think? Or?
You've got the power. You can do that. Your legacy. Thanks very much.
No worries, Pete. On a serious note, though, I've met many people in rural Australia who say that they're usually rugby league teams, sometimes rugby union teams are all the better for the palm workers they have in their communities. So there's that spin-off as well. All good? No worries. Thanks, everyone.
I'd now like to introduce Charlie Peel from the Australian and one of our club committee members to do a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Fran, and on behalf of the Queensland Rural Press Club, I'd like to, and indeed everyone in the audience today, I'd like to thank you, Minister Watt, for your presentation today. It's quite extraordinary, the sheer size of the workload that's fallen on you since you took office just 6 months ago. To be confronted with varroa mite, foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, all within the first month or two, and then these floods that seem to never end. It's certainly been a bit of a baptism by fire. And I reckon you might be the first Ag Minister in a long time to wish it would have just stopped raining. And then there's the steering the future of the ag industry that we all rely on and its various sectors through the many challenges and opportunities ahead. It's also been a bumper year for most sectors, so you've had to walk a bit of a tightrope of talking about the great achievements of the agriculture industry while also being mindful, I guess, that some farmers and some towns are doing it pretty tough at the moment. But I think you've juggled that workload quite well. I'm regularly amazed at the amount of traversing the country that you do, and quite often I'm surprised to see you doing a press conference in, say, Darwin, when it seemed only a couple of hours earlier you were in a wheat field in Moree. So you certainly get around the country, and despite the opposition going to lengths to write you off as merely a lawyer from the Gold Coast, it's pretty clear from your speech today that you're working hard to get across your brief and working hard to do what you think's in the best interests of the industry you've been chosen to represent and the rural communities and the cities indeed that rely on it. So again, on behalf of the Queensland Rural Press Club, thank you for your time today.
Well, that ends the formalities for lunch today. We'd like to thank Natasha and the team at SAS Group for the event management. As always, they do an excellent job. Thank you to Rydges for hosting us here today. I'm very also happy to announce that the Rural Press Club of Queensland's Media Awards have now opened, and they will be open until the 2nd of December. If you have any inquiries around that, please get in contact with Caro, one of our committee members, and please have a look on our own website. This is actually our last in-person event for 2022 at the club, and I'd like to take the opportunity on behalf of James Nason and all of our committee to thank you for your support and your presence at our events in 2022. Well, it feels a little bit early to be saying this. Season's greetings to you all, and we look forward to seeing you next year at the Rural Press Club. Thank you.